Chapter 16. Then, on across South Africa, I awoke before daybreak, and in the gray light I was able to see that the guards were still at their posts. My comrades slept soundly, huddled in their karosses. The fires from the previous evening sent up thin wisps of smoke through the motionless air, and all about us loomed the bulky wagons. Somewhere in the distance, a cock crew. Wessel, I thought. Where have I heard that name before? Not that it is uncommon in South Africa, but that somewhere in the immediate past it had held significance for me. For a few moments it eluded me, and then, as my brain cleared, it came in a flash. Wessel in Cape Town, his story of their family of brothers, their little farm on which diamonds had been discovered, the trickery of the English, their subsequent poverty and hatred for imperialists. It seemed to me that he had told me of a brother who was a captain among the Bears. What a stroke of luck if this were the man! I hardly dared to hope for such good fortune, but I determined to use my knowledge to the best advantage. Wessel and his men returned just as the sun was rising. He went through our papers rapidly, stacking them in two piles, as if he were dealing hands at cards. When he came to mine, he hesitated for a moment, read them through more thoroughly, and then called me by name. "Dean," he said, "is Captain Dean here?" I stepped out from among the others. "So you are an American missionary?" he asked. "Not exactly," I said, and then I explained the nature of my journey. "What's happening in Cape Town these days? I suppose you know as well as we that the Blue Jackets have landed, and that there are rumors of proclaiming martial law throughout Cape Colony." I must admit I do. I decided that the time had come, so I tackled the situation boldly. "Have you a brother in Cape Town?" I asked. He had, and for the next 20 minutes we were on common ground. This fortunate acquaintanceship I made on the Karoo secured for Mtinso and for me the right to proceed unharmed with a full quota of oxen and all our papers. We were very thankful for our deliverance, but our joy was tempered when we found that some of our less fortunate fellows were to be detained. Of the 12 wagons which headed bravely northward from DR6 were confiscated, together with more than half the oxen and freight. Our sadly mutilated train set forth a half-hour later on a very different route than we had planned. The drivers were taking no more chances. They were headed for Middelburg as fast as they could drive their tired oxen. Such an event as the one just related could never have taken place in any recent European war, but in the wholesale guerrilla warfare characterizing the struggle in South Africa, almost anything was possible. Numerous bands of picturesque bears would harass the English wherever they met them, from behind the kopjes or small hills. Sometimes there was open battle, but much oftener it was a fire-and-run sort of fighting. They had confiscated only what they needed of our train. There seemed to be a rough honor about their procedure, yet to every chivalrous bear there were 2 John Smuts, hating the natives like the devil hates holy water, and killing them like flies whenever the opportunity offered itself. We had been on the trail less than 2 hours when we met a British column moving forward to meet the bears. We reported the confiscation of our wagons and the position of the enemy, which caused no little excitement among the English. Wessel's men were Douhet's advance guard, and their proximity meant that an attack from the bears was imminent. The English were determined to stop any further advance of the wedge driven into Cape Colony. On receiving our information, this column moved rapidly forward toward the scene of our disaster. After traveling across the Karoo until we were quite weary of it, we at last came to Middleburg. Here we joined other wagons, and after adding fresh oxen to our depleted and jaded lot, proceeded through country more fertile and prosperous than heretofore. Everywhere about us were fields of produce kept green through irrigation. This country was less rugged than some we had seen, but there were many kopjes, and sometimes in the distance blue lines of mountains. As we were traveling less than 30 miles a day, we had plenty of time for thought. In 3 days of dreaming, I rebuilt the Ethiopian Empire. In 3 days of dreaming, I recaptured Africa for the Africans. Once more, Mashonaland was up higher, and gleaming black bodies brought gold from the mines. The ruins of Zimbabwe were no longer ruins, but stately masonry. The sons of the ancient race who raised those piles of stone to forgotten gods once were proud possessors of all they surveyed, and those dark descendants of the Phoenicians, still worshipping the crane and the ram, retained the genius of their ancestors, sailing their ships to every country, bearing the wealth of Africa, as in the ancient days. Precious stones and metals poured from Sheba northward through all Arabia, and westward down the wide rivers of the jungle. Nowhere were there slaves or poverty or ignorance. In 3 days of dreaming, I dammed the rivers to water the Karoo until the desert bloomed like the rose. I built cities in trackless thickets, and from the forest of Africa constructed such a fleet of graceful ships as the world has ever seen. At last we came to the Kai River, and crossed it late one evening and made our camp. When we awoke next morning, we found ourselves in a beautiful land, filled with game and covered with green foliage. Here there were many buck, slender graceful animals of a dozen varieties, mostly buff or brown in color, with occasionally markings of black. They were timid, with large brown eyes, and could be seen grazing in small herds on every hand. They could often be surprised at water holes, or run down on horseback, and we had no trouble in securing fresh meat. We fished the streams, bathed in the rivers, and enjoyed this part of our journey greatly. When we came to Idityawa, in the middle of the Transky, we took lodgings and rested over Sunday. Here I met Mary Brandon Tully, a young colored missionary from Canada. She had married one of the lesser chiefs of the district and had made the Trotsky her home. She had established a fine mission and had so modernized the native architecture that I found windows and hard-surfaced floors in all the houses, and a degree of culture among the natives unusual in even the older settlements. She offered us the hospitality of her attractive little home, but as we had made other arrangements, we had to decline. At Edutwa, we left the great wagon, drawn by oxen, which had brought us from Dayar, and took the two-wheel government Cape cart, which carried both mail and passengers. It was pulled by 6 mules, and at times we were able to make 7 miles an hour. In general, we arrived at the various villages and stations on scheduled time. Our driver was a Cape-colored. He handled the cart with assurance, although the road was often rough and steep. At first, Mtinzo, the driver, and I were the only occupants, but late the first evening, when we stopped at a small town to change mules, we were joined by an English colonial magistrate. He was of Dutch descent, and although the cart was made to accommodate 6, he was so enormous that he took all the remaining room. Because they were carrying the mail, the Cape carts traveled all night. Mtinzo did not try to sleep, but sat awake, looking up at the stars. I slept fitfully, but the magistrate snored all night long. Occasionally, when the road was particularly rough, he would grunt unhappily and mutter, "Och, what troubles!" but almost immediately he would recommence his snoring. When morning came, he awoke and began to howl for breakfast. "What, not at the station yet? My, what a terrible driver we've got!" The driver hastened to inform him that we were only 6 miles from the station, and that breakfast would surely be ready when we arrived. This assurance brightened the magistrate to such an extent that he decided to have a drink on it, and soon he became voluble in his praise of the scenery. When he found that Mtinzo was a preacher, he began quoting scripture, "Blessed in der man what trusteth in the Lord," and on and on and on. After we had listened to him for 15 minutes, we could none of us bear it any longer. I took it upon myself to quiet him. I told him that I could not reconcile Christianity and imperialism, and that the man who preached the one and practiced the other was in my eyes a hypocrite. He was not at all offended by my thrust. On the contrary, he winked at me, stopped quoting scripture, and offered us his bottle. When we at last reached the post station, we found ourselves in a prosperous little village of some 150 inhabitants. There was a small hotel beside the road, and the bell was ringing for breakfast. The enormous Dutchman, smelling the savory odor of cooking, vaulted over the side of the cart with the agility of a boy, and outstripped us all in reaching the table. We 4 sat down at one table. The Africanado waitress called out the bill of fare. The first on the list was fried chicken, and without waiting to hear another word, we all ordered fried chicken. While the girl was in the kitchen getting our orders, the manager, a young English colonial, entered the room. He wished us a good morning, pleasantly enough, but upon seeing Mtinzo, his manner changed, and he addressed him sharply in Cape Dutch. Mtinzo rose meekly and prepared to leave us. I said, "Wait, Mtinzo, what did he say?" He say black man go eat in kitchen. I was so incensed that a mere hotel keeper should speak in this way to a minister of the cloth that I rose to my feet and, looking the Englishman squarely in the eye, said, I have yet to find a more egotistical people than the English. You may have your choice, apologize to Mtenzo, or answer to me. The Englishman was taken aback, but game. He was all for trial by combat. At this point, however, the magistrate stepped in. He said to the hotel keeper, apologize to him. Sure ting, apologize to him. I will advise them to bring charges against you if you will not apologize. The Englishman, seeing that his license might be endangered, bowed ever so slightly to Mtenzo, and said with a sneer, 1,000 pardons, Your Excellency. Then turning on his heel, he walked from the room with his head thrown back in a proud and militant manner. The incident stands out in my memory, for it was the only occasion during my stay in South Africa on which a colonial official favored a native in argument with an Englishman, and even in this case it was a Dutchman who showed that courtesy, and he was more than half drunk. While we ate breakfast, the attendants changed our mules. The fresh animals carried us forward at a great pace. We rode on hour after hour, and at last came to Umtata, on the borderline between the Trotsky and Pondo land. This town boasted not only a small cottage instituted by the missionaries, but also the seat of magistracy over the two adjoining countries. The official in charge was an old white-haired English general whose name I have forgotten. We had a long talk together while I was at Umtata, and I gathered certain facts regarding the annexation of Pondo land to Cape Colony. But in the typical English colonial manner, he misinterpreted matters to suit his own ends. After a short but pleasant stay, we again took Cape Cart, and after crossing the St. John's River, started for the first time over Pondo soil. This country is as fertile and well-watered as any in South Africa. All the impressions of the land I had gained while passing up and down the coast on the Pedro Gorino were more than confirmed. The exhilarating air, the green velvet meadows, the airy hills, and distant mountains held me silent. In the willows and the blossoming mimosa trees that grew along the streams, birds of a dozen varieties were singing. The game was even more plentiful than it had been in the Trotsky, and within the first 2 or 3 hours of our journey, I noticed several types of antelope we had not seen before. Mtenzo and I shared the cart with 2 Englishmen. One was a magistrate, the other obviously a captain in Her Majesty's army. They were both over 50, well-fed, pompous, and typical of their class. When the cart stopped in a little valley, after fording a stream at one of the drifts, we all got down to stretch our legs. The officer addressed me patronizingly. How do you like our country? Our country indeed, I thought. Yet I doubt if he caught my bitterness when I replied, It's good enough to hold anybody. We arrived at Lusikisky in the center of Pondo land late in the afternoon. Mtenzo took me to the home of one of his native friends, where we put up for the night. Chapter 17. Segao Faku, King of the Pondos. The next morning we prepared to leave for Cow Kinney, the kraal of Segao Faku. As there were no other means of conveyance, we had to proceed afoot. We hired several native boys to carry our rather cumbersome luggage, and before the sun had risen, we were on the trail. The winding path which we followed was so narrow that we had to walk single file. Often we met natives, and always they moved politely to one side to let us pass. We hurried forward, as time was precious, and my curiosity concerning the king of Pondos was growing daily. As we journeyed, our party became larger and larger. Natives joined us at every crawl. When it was learned that we were making a pilgrimage to Sigao Faku, the people along our way grew very respectful and offered us food and huts in which to sleep. In this sequestered region, where fictitious reports would have one believe the most backward tribe in Africa resides, we found the people cleanly, hospitable, and handsome. The huts in which they lived were far more sanitary than the Negro cabins of the southern states, and furnished with soft karosses and simple furniture. They were quite as comfortable. The first evening we stopped with one of the lesser chiefs, where we were treated royally. We were served a meal of broiled chicken, mushrooms cooked in ghee, a sort of native butter, wild tomatoes, umvubu, a dish not unlike cottage cheese to which corn is added, and several varieties of fruit. All this was reinforced by a young kid beautifully baked, which added the last touch to our feast. Who can say that such epicures are barbarians? Nor is good cooking confined to the southern part of the continent. The finest Irish stew I ever ate was at the geographical center of Africa, prepared by a native who did not know the world is round and had never heard of Ireland. But to return to our story, one man at the hut of this chief said nothing but umballa. Every time the chief spoke, this man uttered his single word, until it grew to an enormous and terrible significance. It seemed like some dark incantation. At my first opportunity, I asked Mtenzo the meaning of the word. He said that it meant, "It is true." It seems that it was a rather general custom among the kings and chiefs to hire these hypnotic artists who continue to say, it is true," until the natives believe every word their rulers tell them. In this case, there was no harm done, since the chief was of the better sort, but in many instances such devices employed by rascals work infinite harm. It came to me at this time that the native Ethiopians' naive confidence in their leaders might, if used to the right ends, prove their most valuable asset, but if abused, as it has been in the past, would surely keep them in an abased and lowly position. These people are like a confiding wife. They can see no error or defect, and that has been their downfall. The next morning, after thanking the chief and his large family for their hospitality, we continued on our journey. We walked for several hours, and at last, on entering a broad and fertile plain, we caught our first glimpse of Kalkeni, kraal of King Sigao Faku. We stopped at a distance to view the scene. The kraal was composed of some 300 or 400 symmetrical huts, clustered in an orderly arrangement about a central hut, easily 3 or 4 times the size of any other. The kraal was situated in the midst of park-like country and shaded by 50 or more great trees. A stream passed through it and wound southward to join the St. John's River. As we approached, we discerned several natives, the women in adequate native dress with bright-colored handkerchiefs or cheetah-skin caps on their heads, the children more nearly naked, but by the time we entered the kraal, every one had disappeared. With Mtenso at the head of the column, we advanced rapidly down a deserted path. At last we came to the huge hut we had seen from the plain. It was the dwelling place of the king. Mtenso arranged us in a long line in front of this hut. Then he said, "Now take off the hat. Say Changao. Bow and say Changao." We all bowed very low and simultaneously said the magic word. I learned later that Changao means the sun. Like 1,000 other potentates the world over, Sagao Faku wished to be identified with the most majestic symbol in the universe of our senses. No one arrived, nothing happened, but Mtenso had fulfilled his duty, and he now led us away to comfortable quarters. I was taken to the hut of one of his parishioners. The household consisted of a white-haired man of 50, his younger wife, a girl of 16, and 2 little boys. They were very shy, but hospitable. After Mtenso had introduced me to these people, he hurried away to see his own wife and family, from whom he had been parted for many months. After we had eaten, karosses were spread that I might rest. It was scarcely past noon, yet the morning's walk through the hot sun had tired me to such an extent that I was soon asleep. I was awakened at 3 by Mtenso. His eyes were bright. He told me to follow him quickly. The king had seen me as I bowed before his hut, and he was well pleased. He had sent for me, and Mtenso did not wish to displease him by keeping him waiting. At first, on entering the great hut, from the sunlight I was unable to distinguish anything. Then, as my eyes grew accustomed to the darkness, I perceived such a picture of majesty as one could not easily forget. 20 feet before me, on a huge cowskin, squatted like the Buddha, was Sagao Faku, king of the Pondos. His face was handsome, his skin shining black, his body was enormous and beautifully muscled. He was almost naked, his bright robe thrown to one side. He wore only a breech clout, a single necklace of teeth, and a bracelet of ivory on one arm. An ostrich plume adorned his hair. At Mtenso's whisper, we bowed low 3 times and arose, awaiting the king's pleasure. He held out his hand, and when I took it in mine, I realized what a giant he was. The king spoke, and Mtenso interpreted. He had said, "Speak, friend." I told him briefly why I had come to Pondo land, and thanked him for his courtesy. Mtenso again served as interpreter. The king seemed pleased. He smiled, spoke a half-dozen guttural words, bowed his head 3 times, and again shook my hand. It was evident that he liked me. After these formalities, I was introduced to the Fingo interpreter and the 17 counselors grouped on each side of the king. I had scarcely noticed them before. I had been so fascinated by the potentate himself. Now there was more bowing and shaking of hands. At last 100 or more prominent citizens were admitted to the hut. The covers were taken from 3 barrels of Kaffir beer, and the drink flowed freely. After several hours passed very pleasantly, we returned to our huts for the evening. Early the next morning the king came to my door, with a pure white chicken under his arm. He stood before my hut and called my name. I went out to meet him and accepted his present. He was some 2 inches taller than I, and his splendid body shone in the sunlight. Having handed me the bird, he spoke a few Pondo words and departed. It had all been as decorous as the bestowal of knighthood. Some months later, I shook hands with the Prince of Wales, now King of England, but it was with no such pride as I accepted a white cock from Segou Faku. The natives, who were my hosts, were amazed at the honor. They had never seen the king come alone, bearing the present of a white bird, and I was from that moment forth something superhuman in their eyes. In the days that followed, while I still tarried about the kraal, they treated me with a devotion that would have embarrassed me had I not been used to the ways of natives. Every day or two I met the king. Often Mtenzo was with me to translate our words. The king would ask me, "Are you comfortable in your lodgings? Do you like our country? Will you live with us always?" And I would reply, "I am very comfortable, thank you. I think your country is the most fertile and beautiful in South Africa. I should like to stay here always, but I must return to my ship within a few weeks." I was very anxious to begin building schools and making arrangements for a mission. There were many problems to be solved and many difficulties to be overcome, but I knew it was best not to press matters. I saw the necessity of becoming fully acclimatized and fully acquainted with the country before venturing my entire plan. I knew that Segou Faku was as occupied with the thought of schools as I, but the ways of the native are not as direct and obvious as one might imagine. There is quite as much etiquette and decorum here as in any other part of the world. I realized that when the time was ripe, the king would make the first move. I was merely awaiting a sign. Meanwhile, Mtenzo had exhausted his exchequer. He decided that to support himself and his rather large family, he would have to farm a piece of land and do his preaching in spare time. He came to me for money to buy stock, and I gave him 10 pounds. Very few people in Pondoland have any money whatsoever. The 10 pounds bought an enormous amount of material. Mtenzo came home with a herd of cattle and goats, a flock of chickens, seeds of all kinds, and mealies, and other food sufficient to feed a small army. His prestige in the kraal was doubled, and his sermons carried more weight than ever before. I was not long awaiting a sign. I had been in Kilkenny perhaps a week, when the king came to my door one morning leading 2 fine horses. They were small, as all Pondo horses are, but they were swift for their size and very spirited. Their coats had been brushed until they almost glittered. But joyful as I was at receiving these 2 splendid animals, I was even more joyful when on the same day the king informed me that he had made me one of his counselors. I knew that from that moment forth my advice would carry much weight. Chapter 18. 2 Strange Stories. In the year 1782, the Grosvenor East Indiaman, homeward bound from Ceylon, was wrecked off the south coast of Africa. She was reported to have had £1,000,000 sterling aboard, and silver coins are still picked up on the beach in the vicinity of the wreck. As in the case of hundreds of other ancient disasters, so many myths have sprung up surrounding it that it is hard to separate the truth from the fiction. Several of the accounts, palpably false, tell of terrible hardships endured by these people. Dozens of old romancers, posing as historians, have embellished the tale until it is generally believed that the survivors were forced to walk hundreds of miles through a burning desert-like country, subsisting almost entirely on carrion, being beaten, robbed, and in the case of the women, carried away by the natives, escaping the attacks of wild animals only by miracle, and, with the exception of a mere handful, dying before they reached the Cape. As a matter of fact, the ship was wrecked some 25 miles from what is now Port St. John's on the coast of Pondo Land, where the country was so fertile and the food so plentiful that a baby could have survived. As for the natives, knowing them as I do, I have every reason to believe that they helped these unfortunate men and women. I was at Kilkenny over a century after the disaster, when I learned of an old woman living some 15 miles from the kraal, who, according to all reports, had a skin almost as white as that of an English lady. 100 stories centered about her. Some of the natives thought she was a goddess, and had come on wings like a seagull many years before. Some said that she was the daughter of a castaway. It came to my mind that she might be a descendant of one of the survivors from the Grosvenor. I was determined to look into the matter. With Mtenzo to guide me, I set forth one morning, and at last arrived at a neat stone house lying in a pleasant valley. A girl of perhaps 14 met us at the door. Her skin was dark brown, but it seemed to me that there was a slightly Anglo-Saxon cast to her features. Mtenzo spoke to her in Pondo, explaining something of the nature of our visit. She replied in the same musical tongue in which he had addressed her. "What does she say, Mtenzo?" I asked. To my great surprise, the girl herself answered, and in English. "I said that grandmother is at home if you wish to see her," she explained. We were led into a bright little room, and there before an open window, with the sunshine falling upon her, sat the lady of whom we had heard. Rumor had not exaggerated the whiteness of her skin, nor the Caucasian mold to her face. She was a woman of 65 or 70, white-haired, proud in bearing and soft-spoken. As in the case of her granddaughter, she used both English and Pondo. I had not been mistaken in my surmise. This woman's mother's mother had been aboard the Grosvenor East Indiaman, homeward bound from Ceylon on that ill-fated trip. At our request, she told the story as it had come down by word of mouth. Occasionally a quaint word like "whilst" pointed to the fact that not only the story, but the use of the language as well had been handed down from mother to daughter. There was remarkably little admixture of native or Bear words and phrases. These people had, in a manner, lived to themselves. I had expected her story to be quite unlike the written accounts of the wreck, and in this I was not disappointed. She spoke as if the castaways had actually liked the fertile shores upon which they had been thrown, and while they had always dreamed of some day returning to England, they had settled in Pondoland, rather than attempt the journey to the Cape. She seemed to delight in recounting the story, and her words carried us back to the decks of the Grosvenor. Mary Cartwright was 22 that year, and a widow of less than 2 months. She had accompanied her husband to India, for his regiment had been detailed to foreign service shortly after their marriage, and they could neither of them bear the thought of parting. She had found the country so unlike England that she had been homesick for Devonshire, but the pleasure of being near her young husband had outweighed all other considerations. They had been married a little less than a year when he was brought in one day sick with the fever, and though she had nursed him day and night, he had at last died, leaving her alone in a foreign country. Thus it was that she took passage on the Grosvenor, East Indiaman, and in 1782 was wrecked on the southeast coast of Africa. When the ship had gone aground, the passengers had rushed to the deck in a panic. The surf was so high that all the attempts to launch lifeboats had been futile. A bold swimmer had at last carried a lifeline to shore, and over this all but 15 made their way to safety. Of those who perished on this first day, 14 had fallen into the sea. The 15th was the cook, who had been so drunk that he had refused to leave the ship. Little had been salvaged. The small hoard of provisions was divided among the survivors, and they had set out toward the distant cape, unaware of their true position and of the difficulties they were about to encounter. They followed the coast, and were able to supplement their inadequate stores by gathering shellfish from the sea and picking fruits and berries, which they saw the birds eat freely from the trees and bushes that grew on every hillside. At night they built great fires, more to keep up their courage than to protect them from wild animals, for they were in little danger on that score. During the day they carried lighted firebrands with them, for they had been able to salvage but one poor flint and steel from the wreck. At first the women and children had been able to keep up. The men had assisted them wherever country was rough. At last, however, as they were increasingly aware of their distance from civilization, it was decided that all the sailors and most of the men would go on ahead of the women, and children follow at their own pace. The hope was to reach help quickly and send a rescue party to assist the women and children. After a sad leave-taking, the men went forward, giving more of the provisions than they could easily spare to those who were to follow. 2 days later, the women came to a river so wide and so deep that they were unable to cross it in any manner whatsoever. The men had either been able to swim it, or had found native craft of some description to carry them across. The women were less fortunate, and found the stream a perfect barrier against further progress. The old woman paused a moment, smiled, and gazed out of the window. "My grandmother," she said, "never heard the fate of those who went ahead. I have read stories of their journey which in many respects are to be doubted. It is said that on the 6th day after their parting with the women, they ran out of provisions. They had come upon a region so dry and so barren that they could find no food wherewith to nourish their bodies, nor water wherewith they might quench their thirst. These accounts tell how they discovered, thrown up upon the shore, a dead seal, which they tore to pieces like wild beasts in their desire for food. It is stated that they walked weary miles with parched tongues, even drinking the sea water and worse. The mussels which they gathered here were so salt that they only increased their agony. Most doubtful of all are those parts of the stories which relate the brutality of the natives. My grandmother's story tells of nothing but kindness at the hands of the natives, but of the women who were left behind. She pictured for us the crude camp these women made, waiting day after day for the rescue party, which never came. Mary Cartwright, along with her thoughts, hardly cared what happened, yet more than anything else she dreaded inactivity and the chance it gave her to brood. It was for this reason, more than any other, that she attempted the rash feat of swimming the mile of water at the river's mouth, separating her from the far shore, and consequently from the outer world. She had bid good-bye to her friends, put most of her clothing and her share of the provisions in a small pack tied upon her head, slipped into the water, and struck out. For some time she had swum strongly, but before she had approached the other shore, she was tiring rapidly. The slow current was carrying her toward the sea, around a great bend in the river. At last, when she looked back, she could no longer see the women on the bank far behind her. Then, just before exhaustion overtook her, a native canoe had slipped from the willows, and a lithe black paddler had lifted her to safety. The native was a young chief. He had come to fish in the estuary, and had sat all afternoon among the willows, catching catfish. He had caught all that he wanted, and was preparing to make the trip back up the river to his kraal. Suddenly, to his great amazement, he had seen a very beautiful girl, whose skin was apparently white as white mimosa blossoms, swimming feebly and being carried seaward. He had shot out with his canoe and lifted her into it. She had gone with him to his kraal. Nothing was of great importance now. She had liked the fertile country, and the worship she received from the young chief and his natives. At last she had given him her body and her hand in native marriage, and she had not been unhappy in her long lifetime apart from her own people. Several times she had met others of the women who had survived the wreck. They all had native husbands, but their stories were not of violence. As lotus eaters, they forgot their native land and were happy here. The woman before us smiled as if to say, "There is little more to tell," and then she asked us a little proudly, "I am white, am I not, to come of a strain into which dark blood has been twice intermixed? I am really lighter than my mother." We assured her that she was as white as any English lady, and I added, much more interesting, she invited us to stay to dinner, but as we thought it necessary to return to Kilkenny as soon as possible, we declined with thanks. As we rode homeward, my mind was filled with the story of the wreck, and I wondered greatly that even in such an early day the natives were maligned to the outer world. I was still dreaming of the Gros Venor when shortly after noon we reached Kilkenny and were approached by a messenger from the king. The king wished us to come to his great hut, and Mtenzo and I hurried forward. When we arrived, he took us to a shaded mound some 100 feet from the doorway, where we sat for a time talking of nothing in particular. Then the king asked, "Have you heard the true story of how the Pondos lost their freedom?" When Mtenzo had translated, I assured Sagafaku I had not heard the story, whereupon he recounted an almost unbelievable tale of his recent trouble with the English colonial officials. He recounted how Cecil Rhodes, Prime Minister of Cape Colony, usurped his power and stole from him his hereditary jurisdiction over Pondo land. Here is the story as he told it to me. Some 5 or 6 years before, 6 Cape carts had come to Pondo land, carrying altogether 30 or 35 Europeans, garbed as missionaries. These people were given a hospitable welcome by the unsophisticated natives. They were given food to eat and huts in which to sleep. They had accepted the natives' hospitality, and for several weeks had surveyed and observed the country. Then one day they left as suddenly and as mysteriously as they had come. They arrived at Lasikisiki, and by a preconceived plan wired Cecil Rose that the Pondos were rising. There was great excitement throughout Cape Colony. Rhodes had immediately ordered British regiments to occupy Pondo land. They had come in 3 great columns from the north, and from the west, and from the south. They had entered this peaceful country shooting at everybody they saw. Any little group of natives, huddled together in fear, was a sufficient excuse for a charge. Scores of innocent Pondos were butchered. There was not a single case of resistance, for these people were not only entirely unarmed, but they were attacked without warning and without provocation. The occupation by the British regiments was a complete surprise. When the advance guard reached Kilkenny and threw their guns in Sagafaku's face, there was not a more astonished man in Africa. The report that the Pondos had risen was absolutely false. They had had nothing to rise against, having been independent until this time, and they had no effective arms with which to rise. The English had seen to that. They were merely a peace-loving, pastoral people without malice, less savage by far than the land-mad Englishmen who had poured down upon them. Sagafaku, together with his counselors, was arrested and taken to Cape Town. All during the months of his absence, the regiments were billeted upon the impoverished natives. The king had to sustain an expensive trial in Cape Town. When at last he was acquitted of all charges brought against him, he returned to his once prosperous and happy country, only to find it a shadow of its former self. 90,000 of the 100,000 head of cattle had been confiscated. The country was subjected to a killing taxation, designed to keep it from ever again reaching a powerful state. Thus the Pondos overnight were reduced from opulence to poverty. "There," said the king, pointing to 9 obsolete rifles leaning against his hut, "is the entire armament of a once powerful nation." Then his eyes became suddenly fierce, and the great muscles of his body quivered. His voice became hoarse with passion. "Ceci bon wagna bezi zwena." Even now the white man watches us. Then Mtenzo, raised to a high pitch of excitement by the story, shouted, "Lizodu mi li mutate!" We shall strike them and take them prisoners. What could I do? I wished to quiet these men, show them that only through development of mind could they rise above the invaders, but I myself was overwhelmed with anger, and I could not use cold logic and impersonal arguments on a subject that stirred my emotions as this one did. That evening I wrote this note to a friend back in the United States. Dear Alfred, today I have heard two strange stories. The first was the story of the wreck of the Grosvenor from the lips of a descendant of one of the survivors. It would merely entertain you. The second was such a tale of imperialism as has never before come to my ears. I am sure it would anger you through and through. I have never been able to conceive the imperialists as anything but vulgar murderers and thieves, whose egotistical, crafty, and cunning natures hold no respect for intellectual or moral values. But upon hearing the story of the unlawful annexation of Pondo land to Cape Colony, as it has just been related to Sagafaku, king of the Pondos, my estimation of their nature puts them upon an even lower level than heretofore. Nothing will deter these men save physical power superior to their own and sufficiently strong to strike terror into their leathern hearts. Their principal activity is marching up and down the world, sowing dragons' teeth, and their principal aim to amass more gold than any who went before them. Unless humanity learns to choose for its leaders philosophers instead of the megalomaniacs they have been choosing for the past 16 centuries, their mechanical inventions and arms of precision will eventually help them to destroy themselves and to wipe the human race from the face of the earth. Your friend, Captain Harry Dean.